Right, here's the bottom end of that BSA A65 engine, now obviously removed from the frame, and I've got the primary side completely stripped down and the timing side also stripped, and the crankcases are pretty much ready for separating now. This is the engine that I obviously started and ran very briefly in my last video and demonstrated the noises it was making, which caused some consternation and concern. And why would you run an engine when it sounded like that? Well, the owner ran the engine when he brought the bike here, and I heard it, and I decided for myself that although it shouldn't sound like that, it wasn't the sort of noise that was going to suddenly create a great big hole in the crankcase or anything like that. So I was certain, and actually proved correct, that the timing gear was responsible for the noises we were hearing there, although there are other things worn in the engine, and I'm going to come to that in a moment. But basically we had the timing pinion slapping slightly back and forth on its key on the shaft there, and the nut securing it, the worm nut that drives the oil pump, wasn't really done up that tight. So I feel that had that been tighter, we probably wouldn't have heard the noise at all. But it's led us in to see and find other things. Now, interestingly enough, the owner bought this bike and did 6.5 miles on it before the noises started, and well, it ended up here obviously. There's a few interesting things, and bear in mind the 6.5 miles is there's the pistons there, the carbon on those, and there's also a bit of thrust wear being taking place there on the, it's not anything too alarming, but there's obviously been some miles and maybe some heat, got a bit of carbon there. So I would suggest that perhaps this engine has done quite a bit more than 6.5 miles since it was last rebuilt. When I removed the timing cover, as we've already seen in my last video, there was a nice shiny new blue SRM oil pump there, and that, I think, may have been fitted in order to try and mask some other issues that were taking place. But also the SRM oil pumps come with a new drive worm, which is the nut that secures the timing pinion. So I think what's happened is the SRM oil pump has been fitted and its worm nut screwed up, but not tightly enough against the timing pinion, and that's been allowed to rattle and chatter, and that's where the noises have come from that the owner heard. But I think the reason that the SRM oil pump may be fitted could be down to this. Hopefully the camera will pick this up, because the engine's going to rock about a bit as I do it, but that's the dreaded play in the timing side bush between the crank journal and the timing side bush, and there's a lot of it. There's also end float. Now the end float is supposed to be between 1.5 and 3/1000ths of an inch, but I can see that that's a good bit more than that. Although, to be fair, I have seen more end float than that on engines which have been running quietly. So that end float is not too alarming to me, but that certainly is. And I think possibly what's been done is perhaps the SRM oil pump has been fitted in order to boost oil flow and pressure, and perhaps it was in an attempt to quieten this down to some degree. We didn't really hear that making a noise in the video, because it was all the timing gear was making all the clattering, but I would suspect that if the bike was being ridden and it was being ridden under load, there'd be quite a sort of clonking sound coming from that, as well as the irritating sort of metallic noises we were getting from the timing gear. So I think the SRM oil pump may have been fitted to try and mask that, and when that was fitted, the worm nut wasn't tightened up tight enough, and so the timing pinion's been able to slap around, and luckily that has brought the owner's attention to it and brought it here, and we now find ourselves in a situation where we're going to strip the whole thing down. I'll split the cases The big ends actually feel fine. I've had the pistons off, I've had this out here and felt them. There's a small amount of side to side play in the conrods as you'd expect, but I haven't been able to feel any up and down. But I'll be taking them off and having a look at the shells, the condition of them, and the journals obviously, and the dreaded fabled sludge trap in the crank. I'll make sure that that's all nice and clean as well. So it'll be a full-on rebuild, this one, and obviously we'll address the timing side bush and the crank end float as well. And I'm sure that when the timing pinion goes back on and the worm nut's done up tightly against it, possibly need to fit a new key perhaps. The keyway in the crank looks undamaged, thankfully, and that should quieten things down considerably. So that's the plan. And I was sort of taken to task a little about starting that engine when it makes noises like that, but as I said, I'd heard it beforehand and I was pretty certain that what we were hearing wasn't going to do any sudden further damage, but I wanted to do it so we've got a sort of yardstick for when it's all put back together and we can hopefully listen to it again sounding much quieter. Just to add to what I've already said about this engine, I've worked on quite a few A65 engines and perhaps other people have got similar ideas and dodges, but here's one of mine. When you lift the cylinder barrels off these engines, the cam followers can drop right out and go into the crankcase if you're not ready for them, although some do seem to have preventers. What I do is I get some suitably sized rubber fuel or oil hose, short lengths of, and just before I lift the barrels, just push those lengths of hose over the ends of the followers, and then the followers can't drop out. And it holds them nice and secure, and there's no worries when you're putting the thing back together either. So there's a little trick of mine.